Indigenous academia, stories and histories are a vital contribution in understanding our shared Australian history from more than just a white, predominantly male perspective. Scientific research of Indigenous people, as well as historic events, have been reiterated by Western authors, often with no regard or inclusion of an Indigenous perspective. As articulated by Nakata, the scientific research and studies of Indigenous people were constructed from a rigid Western framework that essentially boxed Indigenous communities into set criteria. Arguably, this sentiment continues today, as it has been this exact approach throughout history that has helped establish the binaries prominent when discussing Indigenous Australia. As a result, Indigenous Australians have been forced to adapt and change significant parts of their culture, lifestyle, and tradition to fit into these Western frameworks that constitute modern Australia. In fact, according to Mundy, the aforementioned Western studies of Indigenous people were only useful to Aboriginal communities when they needed scientific-based evidence to gain credibility within Western systems. Considering that Indigenous communities are heavily reliant on oral tradition, the lack of hard documented proof meant that their own stories were not considered valid evidence. As a result, the Indigenous community's continuation of stories and traditions have been significantly impacted and often lost or changed to fit this Western culture. Modern-day Australia has acknowledged that historically, not including Indigenous perspectives on a broad range of issues, including education, health, and social academics, has had major implications when attempting to create an inclusive Australia. Steps have been taken for non-Indigenous Australians, including people from a wide range of cultures, to appreciate and comprehend the culture and identity of Aboriginal people of this land. However, arguably this interest in inclusivity is limited to the point where Western lifestyles are not confronted, challenged, or changed. This is not a new sentiment, but one that mirrors history, when in the 1800s the Australian government established Indigenous reserves to allow communities to live freely, but within the boundaries prescribed by the white government. The attempts to include Indigenous viewpoints into contemporary Australia have been largely superficial, as it's still the white-centric government policies that ultimately determine how Indigenous people are supposed to live. Regardless of the fact that Aboriginal communities have been recognised as the traditional owners of the land, they are still forced to adapt their lifestyles to fit into this Western world. While the nation-state cannot be reversed, there are significant changes to ensure a stronger Indigenous voice. Just as the Indigenous communities had to adapt and bend their lifestyle, it is imperative that the non-Indigenous communities reciprocate to at least reach a form of compromise. For an actual inclusive Australia, many will have to acknowledge and amend their white privilege. Interestingly, in Hollinsworth's article, Race, Ethnicity and Education, many Australian students did not want to even acknowledge the notion of white privilege, let alone accept and attempt to change it. This speaks volumes in illustrating how much more Indigenous perspective is necessary in the contemporary discourse of Australia, and just how far the society has to go.